In a small residential colony in Narsinghpur, people started disappearing in total silence. The police found dead bodies, but they lacked any terrestrial evidence. No murder weapons, there were no fingerprints, and no signs of a struggle. Security footage revealed a recurring pattern. At exactly 2:17 a.m., victims would stop, look behind them, and then a tiny, unidentifiable mass would lunge at their backs. The camera always cuts to static the moment it strikes. Raghav, a crime journalist with a career built on debunking urban legends, arrived to investigate. He viewed the colony not as a haunt, but as a crime scene where a human perpetrator was likely using local folklore to mask their tracks. His skepticism was his primary tool. He believed that every haunting had a logical conclusion if you followed the data long enough. But the data in Narsinghpur was about to defy every law of physics he knew. A local resident named Shakila Aapa offered a name for the entity, the Dedfutiya. She described a figure standing exactly 1.5 feet tall, an incomplete, half-burned spirit possessing 100 times the strength of a human. She detailed the entity's primary hunting mechanic. It mimics the voice of a child or a loved one to lure targets. The physical attack only triggers if the person breaks protocol and turns their head to identify the source of the sound. Raghav assumed the child's voice, reported by witnesses, was a recording used by a human kidnapper to lure victims into an ambush. To catch the perpetrator in the act, he walked into the dark at 2 a.m. When he heard the cry and turned to intervene, he was instantly pinned to the pavement by a tiny, pupilless creature. Gasping for air under the entity's weight, he reached for the heavy object in his pocket. He struck the creature with his iron house keys, and it instantly shrieked and recoiled. The metal seemed to cause a violent chemical reaction upon contact. Raghav escaped the physical encounter, but the entity had already collected its toll. When he finally stood up, he realized the creature was gone, and so was his shadow. Shadow theft has a specific biological cost. Without a shadow to anchor them, the host's life force begins to drain. The victim starts to hollow out, losing their internal vitality over the coming days. Raghav's condition worsened. Under the harsh glare of streetlights, his shadow was no longer a slave to his anatomy. It stood completely independently, slowly raising its dark arm and pointing into the darkness, while Raghav remained perfectly still. The investigation eventually led Raghav to a terrestrial motive. The entity hadn't appeared by accident. It was a weaponized asset summoned by a wealthy real estate developer and a local Tantrik working in tandem. This chart tracks Narsinghpur property values. The stable baseline collapses into an aggressive plummet that aligns perfectly with the timeline of the reported deaths. The paranormal was being used to crash the market, allowing the developer to buy the entire colony for a fraction of its worth. Raghav was targeted because of his reach. As a prominent journalist, his reports on the entity acted as a megaphone for the panic, accelerating the market's decline, exactly as the builder had planned. The architecture of this horror reveals a grim reality. The entity was a mere tool. Human greed was the actual mechanism of destruction. Raghav attempted to trap the entity in a ruined factory using the iron rule. He constructed a containment field of heavy iron bars and used ancient mantras to pin the spirit in place. His plan failed because he misunderstood the Jinn's biology. The theft of the shadow is a functional necessity for the Dedfutiya. It hollows out the body to create a biological vessel for total possession. Possession manifested through physical mutation. Raghav's limbs began to contort at impossible angles, and his vocal cords warped. His voice became a heavy, resonant frequency that sounded like shifting gravel. Raghav stood before a mirror and saw a stranger. In the shattered glass, his own reflection had been replaced by the pupilless, half-burned face of the Dedfutiya. This is the cost of attempting to control a volatile system. Arrogance leads to the collapse of the containment, and the vessel becomes the very thing it tried to trap. The final confrontation took place at an old leather factory, where the developer and Tantrik were monitoring their success. They believed they had the entity under control, unaware that the host had become a weapon. Raghav knew the Jinn's elemental origin. born of fire and smoke, the entity could only be neutralized by weaponizing its own element. Raghav stormed the factory, using the Jinn's supernatural speed to bypass the guards. His human consciousness fought for a final moment of clarity as he cornered the men responsible for the colony's deaths. He bound his own body in heavy iron chains, locking his limbs and the spirit inside. He had to ensure that when he triggered the end, the Jinn couldn't escape as smoke. Raghav ignited the factory's chemical stores. The resulting explosion destroyed the vessel, the builder, and the Tantrik in a single, violent stroke of elemental fire. Breaking the engineered curse required total self-sacrifice. Raghav turned the entity's own rules against it, ensuring the master and the monster died together. The authorities officially closed the Narsinghpur file, attributing the factory disaster to a mundane gas leak. The files were archived, and the public's rational worldview remained intact. But the fire only killed the human masters. The Dedfutiya survived the blast, and without a vessel or a contract to bind it, the entity was now completely untethered. New security footage from the outskirts of the city suggests the entity is still hunting. A monochromatic feed shows a tiny, distorted shadow waving from the corner of the frame as an unaware security guard walks by. The system is now rogue. If you are walking at night and hear a voice you recognize calling from the shadows, whatever you do, do not look back.